We will start with the FDA and Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy session. And the thought is that since these two talks are combined, we would have the two talks and then have both Amy and Pat sit here to take questions from the group. So the first speaker will be Andrea Tan from the FDA, an operations research analyst from the Center for Drug Evaluation Research, who is going to talk to us about the new FDA patient-focused drug development program. And then that will be followed by the perspective of patient, a family member who is working with this program, Pat Furlong, founding president and chief executive officer of the Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy. And I think this is an incredibly important program, and I hope that you'll learn a lot about how it works. So, Amy, that'd be great.
Hi, everyone, and good morning. We're going to shift gears a little bit. We've heard about a great NIH program this morning, and now I'm going to move on and talk about an exciting new initiative we're doing at FDA to bring the patient voice closer to our FDA reviewers. And again, I'm Andrea Tan. I'm from the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at FDA. So a brief overview of my presentation. I'll be going through background on the patient-focused drug development meetings, how they relate to CDER's benefit-risk framework, and our commitment in the fifth reauthorization of the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, also known as PDUFA 5. For those of you that might be more familiar with this initiative, just please bear with me as I go through the basics. I'll then talk through our approach for how we identify the disease area topics for these meetings, and then describe the approach that we took in developing the strategy for what these meetings might look like. And then I'll review some past meetings that we've had to date so far, that's 3 of them, and talk about one coming up in just about 2 weeks, and leave you with some parting thoughts on lessons learned through this initiative. So the mission of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research is to ensure that safe and effective drugs are available to Americans. And we've realized that review of new drugs is an increasingly complicated regulatory task, which has shown a need for a more structured approach for our benefit-risk decisions, which is part of our regulatory decision-making. To address that need, we've developed this benefit-risk framework, which breaks up information about a decision into 5 key decision factors. The analysis of conditions, so how severe is a condition? Does it change over time? Are there impacts on subpopulations that are really distinct? The current treatment options, so what's the status of the armamentarium? Are there many drugs available to treat this disease, or is there nothing available? And then benefit risk and risk management, where the evidence in the clinical trials is described. So we see the top 2 rows, the analysis of condition and current treatment options, as being distinct from the last 3, in that they really set the context and set the stage for how our clinical reviewers look through the benefits and risks seen in a clinical trial. We think of these as really helping a reviewer understand how to weigh the evidence of the benefits and risks. And it's in that context where we really saw an opportunity to incorporate the patient perspective in informing our benefit-risk decisions. We saw a need to more systematically incorporate our patient perspectives because if you're familiar with FDA processes, our current mechanisms are often limited to incorporating patient voices, but only with respect to specific products. So for instance, if you're familiar with our FDA advisory committee meetings, there's often patient testimony during those meetings, but that's again specific to the product that's under review at that moment. So some quick background on PDUFA 5 for those of you that aren't as familiar. The Prescription Drug User Fee Act, also known as PDUFA, is part of our commitment to PDUFA authorizes FDA to collect fees from companies for review of new drug applications and oversight of drug products. And each reauthorization of PDUFA is associated with enhancements to the new PDUFA program. Given the opportunity that we recognized earlier, we saw that we could incorporate patient-focused drug development as part of our commitments for the 5th reauthorization of PDUFA, also known as PDUFA 5. And what we saw we could do is have meetings on specific disease areas to start to build the narrative of the patient voice and bring that closer to FDA. So we committed to having about 4 meetings per year over the course of PDUFA 5, which is in effect from fiscal years 13 through 17. And each meeting would be focused on a different disease area. So in order to figure out which diseases would be the focus of these meetings, we used a nomination and selection process to narrow down the diseases. In September of last year, we put out a preliminary list of about 40 diseases that could be potential candidates for meeting topics. We then collected public input through a public meeting and an online docket through which patients and the public could submit electronic comments through a website. And we saw a huge response from the community. We got over 4,500 comments, which addressed a range of about 90 disease areas. So we really had our work cut out for us. And what we then did was analyze those comments, take them back to our FDA review divisions, and then talk through with the review divisions their perspectives on the diseases. So we ended up with 16 meetings for the first 3 years of PDUFA. So remember, PDUFA 5 is in effect for 5 years. And we didn't want to lock down all the diseases for the next 5 years. So we decided on the diseases for just those first 3 years, fiscal years 2013 through 2015. We announced this in April of this year, and what we're going to do to determine the diseases for the last 2 years of PDUFA is have another public process starting in about 2015 involving a docket and public meeting. So these are the factors that we were thinking about in identifying the diseases for the preliminary list and for the meetings. We wanted to make sure we were having meetings on diseases that were chronic, symptomatic, and affected patients' daily lives. We wanted to make sure we were having meetings on diseases for which aspects of that disease might not be captured well in current clinical trials. And we also wanted to cover diseases for which there were no therapies or very few therapies, or the therapies that are available don't directly affect how a patient feels, functions, or survives. We also wanted to make sure we were covering a broad range of diseases. So we wanted to make sure the meetings were covering diseases that were both very severe and life-threatening, and also diseases that were more symptomatic. We wanted to pay attention to diseases for which severe impacts on subpopulations might exist. And we also wanted to make sure we were covering common diseases and rare diseases. So here's a list of meetings for the first year of PDUFA, fiscal 2013. We had our first meeting on myalgic encephalomyelitis and chronic fatigue syndrome, also known as ME/CFS, in April of this year. We had 2 meetings in June on HIV and lung cancer, and then we have one coming up on narcolepsy in about 2 weeks. So I won't read through all of these, but here's the first slide of the rest of the meetings for fiscal years 2014 and 2015. And here's our second slide on that. And this full list is on our FDA website. If you search for FDA patient focused, it should be one of the first things that pop up. And the meetings, the dates for these have not yet been announced, but you can monitor our website to see when those will be. So in developing the approach for these meetings, we thought really carefully about what we want to keep in mind as we develop the design. And we wanted to make sure that we could tailor each meeting to make sense for the patient population and also the interests of FDA. So we took into account the current state of drug development and saw that we could customize the design of the meeting and what the day looked like, and also the actual questions that we'd be asking of patients. And I'll get back to that in a little bit. We wanted to make sure we were obtaining broad patient input and also covering a range of patient perspectives and experiences. And we wanted to make sure we're using effective formats for collecting that input so that we could faithfully capture patient views, but also provide usable and useful input to our FDA reviewers who are later on going to be using that input in making their benefit-risk decisions. We also wanted to make sure that our venues were accessible. So for those that weren't able to attend the meetings in person, we've set up webcasts, some of which were interactive. Patients could actually type in comments in real time, and our webcast moderator would read those comments out loud to keep those remotely participating engaged. We also have been emphasizing throughout that the docket is available for every meeting. And this is, again, through a website called regulations.gov, and we very carefully analyze all the docket comments that we receive. So what these meetings might look like for those of you that haven't been familiar with these, what we do is invite patients to present as part of an opening panel to kick off a discussion. And that panel is made of about 4 to 5 patients that volunteer ahead of time. We then open up the discussion to all the patients in the room in a large group discussion that's facilitated by an FDA staff member. We've also thought through using small group breakout sessions when a patient population is particularly heterogeneous or if there's a very large subgroup in a patient population. And you can see that this is really a learning process for us, and we're being very transparent about as we go through each meeting, we're learning little by little. So I've talked through what the day might look like and the design of the meetings, and now I'll move on to what we're actually asking in these meetings. So we developed this general set of questions based on help from FDA reviewers and also a group of patient advocates to see if these questions made sense for patients. And you can see that this topic is aligned with that first row of the benefit risk framework that I described, the analysis of the condition. So these questions relate to the symptoms and impacts that matter most to patients, and I'll just briefly walk through them. We've been asking patients which symptoms and impacts have the most significant impact on their lives. We've been asking about specific activities that patients can't fully do because of their condition, how their condition has changed over time, and what worries them most about their condition. These questions are related to the second broad topic of current treatment options and patients' perspectives on those options. And we've been asking patients what they're doing to treat their condition, how well their treatment regimen has worked for them, what are the most significant downsides of these treatments, and assuming there's no cure, what would a patient look for in an ideal treatment? And again, these are general questions that we've been tailoring for each meeting to make sense for that disease. So after each meeting is over and we've been collecting input through the docket closes. And then we generate a report that summarizes what we heard at the meeting, trying to use patients' own words. We're also careful, and it's important to make sure that we include themes from the docket comments, and we pay particular focus on new perspectives in the docket that we might not have heard at the meeting. The report is then posted online at our FDA website and also shared with our internal FDA reviewers. And I'd like to point out that it's not as if this is the first time that these reviewers are seeing this material. Rather, the FDA reviewers, the experts for that therapeutic area, are an integral part of the planning process for these meetings. And they actually sit in the front panel with the patient panel, and they help us determine what questions they want to hear, what questions they want to ask from patients and hear about. So you can imagine that the report then is something that the reviewers can later refer to and then look to for insights when FDA reviewers are doing their benefit risk assessments for a product that's intended to treat that disease. We also envision that the narratives generated through these meetings and in the report could eventually inform research agendas for new outcome measures such as patient-reported outcomes. So here's a sample excerpt from a meeting report for ME/CFS, and you can see that we utilize quotes in the report, and for this particular segment, we've highlighted the symptom of sore throat that was discussed at the meeting. And we're trying to do this in a way that is accessible and easily digestible for FDA reviewers and for other stakeholders that are interested in these reports. So I'll now just review the meetings we've had to date and talk about the one that's coming up. And in general, we've really heard great positive feedback from both the patients who've been involved in these meetings and from our FDA staff who've said that they've been enormously helpful. Our first meeting was held on ME/CFS, and this was actually a half-day meeting that was part of a bigger 2-day workshop. The second day was focused on a more technical discussion with input from regulatory experts, industry, and academic experts in the field. And the day 1 discussion was what was focused on our patient-focused drug development topics, the most significant symptoms of the disease on patients' daily lives, and perspectives on current treatment options. One of the biggest takeaways about this meeting was that the patient community was really engaged, and it was just so impressive to see how much the patients and the advocacy community prepared in advance. One of the advocacy communities actually developed webinars to help patients prepare for the meeting and understand what the meeting was about. The panelists who presented at the beginning of each discussion were very well prepared, and actually all of the audience members who contributed in the large group discussion were really thoughtful in their contributions. And there was also a very high attendance of patients both in the room and on the webcast. The second meeting was held on HIV, and this was in June of this year. And this was a full-day meeting focused on two primary topics: the topic of patient perspectives on treatment options, and then perspectives on HIV cure research. And that conversation dipped into how patients felt about participating in clinical trials and their perspectives on informed consent. And for this meeting, we tried something a little bit different. We actually used real-time polling questions. So we handed out keypads to those patients in the room, and they were asked to respond to multiple choice answers that they could answer in real time, and we saw the results of those up on the screen during the meeting. And this was in no means a scientific survey, but it just allowed us to get a pulse check on the audience, see some numbers on how they were feeling about particular questions, and really acted as more of a discussion aid. We also tried out incorporating comments in real time from people on the webcast, as I described earlier, and we really think this did a good job of enabling broader participation from those remote attendees. Our next meeting was on lung cancer, and this was a half-day meeting, again, focused on our primary patient-focused drug development topics. We also delved into a discussion on the different factors that patients think about when they're thinking about their lung cancer treatments. And what we did was use a hypothetical scenario to dig into that topic a little bit more, again, as a discussion aid. We continued to use the real-time polling questions and saw that's worked pretty well, and also continued to incorporate the webcast comments in real time. So our next meeting is coming up in less than 2 weeks, and that's going to be on narcolepsy. This is going to be a half-day meeting, again, focused on the primary patient-focused topics. And it's of note that this is our first rare disease of this series of meetings. It's been really incredible to see the response from the patient community for this meeting. The meeting room has actually reached capacity, and we've had to close registration. And we have, I think, hundreds of people signed up for the webcast. So it's been just so impressive to see the community's engagement. To that end, we're actually going to be experimenting with another form of remote participation. We're going to open up a phone line, sort of in the way that the radio talk show hosts say, okay, we'll be opening up the line now for those that have any comments. And we're going to see how that works in incorporating the remote participant's voice more. So I'll just leave you with some parting thoughts on what we've learned throughout this process. And again, it's been an evolving kind of thinking with these meetings, and we're really just trying to learn as much as possible as we go through the process. We've seen that the patient testimonies, the caregivers, the advocate testimonies have been so powerful and have really humbled us in many ways. And we've also been happy to see that we can effectively tailor each meeting to fit the needs of the patient population. At the same time, we also recognize that it's definitely a challenge to make sure we're getting the entire range of the patient perspective at these meetings, and that's something that we acknowledge. And finally, we could not do this without the patient stakeholder community, and their involvement has just been so instrumental in these meetings. And we really look forward to continuing that engagement and continuing this dialogue to bring the patient voice closer to FDA. That's all I have, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
I think we'll hold the questions till after Pat's presentation. So the next presentation may be Pat Furlong, who has done an extraordinary job of championing the cause of the muscular dystrophies and the need for better treatments.
All right. So my name is Pat Furlong, and for those of you who don't know me, I've been around for some time. And 30 years ago, I came to the NIH and asked them what they were doing, and this was Dr. Gerald Fishback. and ask him what he was doing about Duchenne muscular dystrophy, specifically in the neuromuscular diseases, in particular, the rare diseases. And I think that I can say safely that it was very little. So I had to think about, why are we here? Why was I here? Why were we all here? And what happens in the rare disease space? And as patients and family members of people we care about who have these diseases, who are we? I come from a background of medicine. I have a master's degree in med-surg nursing. I spent my life in ICU, CCU, and renal dialysis. I had a view that children didn't get sick. Don't ask me why. I must have closed my eyes during the time I was in pediatrics. I think I more had hoped children would not get sick, and more specifically that my own children would never be sick. And then in 1984, my two boys were diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. I saw a physician who said to me, they're walking now, but soon they won't walk, and then before they're teenagers, they'll be dead. It wasn't a very good day for me, and I didn't really accept that as good medical care. In fact, I pulled him to my face and I said, I wish you weren't alive today, which was probably a little uncomfortable for this particular interaction. And then I decided that perhaps I could do something, and I didn't know what something was. So then I had to think about the ecosystem and where we are and what do patients do, because I was typically on the side of medicine, having had a relatively healthy family and a healthy life. So I always thought the patient was the other person. And so now I had to think about, where does the patient fit in all this, and who are we? So I've come to believe, and this slide is compliments of Sharon Hesterly, who's our scientific director, we're in this ecosystem and we're all together in it. We're patients and we're regulators and we're government and we're companies and we're investors and we're people who are going to be reimbursing for the drugs we hope are developed for the people we care about. So we're all in this together, and we should have an equal vote and equal voting privileges. And when we talk about, are you just sitting there listening? No, we're all here. We all have an opinion, sometimes maybe too many opinions, but certainly opinions that are worth sharing. I always like to start with beginning and end with patients. This is what we're all about. We're really about trying to change the lives of the people we care about, and that's all that matters. How we get there is complicated, but it really is about patients and about who they are and about changing the prognosis of the disease that they have. So a little bit about what we do as patients and advocates in this space and where we look. You get a diagnosis and we go we connect to resources that are there, right? Whatever resources, and they're everywhere. We connect to doctors and online and Facebook and Google and WebMD and all these sorts of things. We try to figure out where are the best resources, and we connect to families and we connect to conferences, and we are online for all of the things that happen, is collecting as much information in as short of reasonable period as possible so that we could do something. So this is what motivates us, right? We're motivated to support organizations, but to help other families. But at the end of the day, we're really here to help the people we care about. We want something to change based on a prognosis that they have. So when we activate our roles as caregivers, we have a lot of things that are involved there. And I wanted you to see that there's a lot in this, in the role of the caregiver, in the role of taking care of or loving someone with a rare disease. And early in my career, I have to say I was an islander. I came from a pretty healthy family, Germans who thought they were healthy stocked. I always imagined a cow with a brand and felt like I was one of them, and it said healthy, and we'd produce the best something or other. So therefore, I felt like I was shielded from illness until my sons were diagnosed, and until a couple people around me died of rare diseases. I also have to say to you that I am a spontaneous carrier. My mother is not a carrier, so it came as a total surprise, even when I wanted to point the finger at one of those Germans. So I'm a spontaneous carrier. I became a consumer later in my life to look at what's on TV and what do I hear in various publications. As a nurse, I learned much more about the diseases that were in my patients in the ICU and the CCU, and certainly in my dialysis patients. But I was only a consumer, really, and I was learning as opposed to really thinking about how to apply them to me. I was working on my patients. And then when my sons were diagnosed, I became a participant. I wanted to know and be a part of and included in the healthcare team that took care of them. And the sad realization that that healthcare team didn't know a whole lot about taking care of them, and certainly not any great ideas about changing the prognosis that they had. And then as I learned and sort of got to know and came to see people like Gerald Fishbeck, and certainly over those years, every other person that I came across at the NIH, I became an influencer. And this doesn't happen easily or overnight. Keep in mind, it's 30 years and we condensed the time now. But it's also about connecting to people in other communities as well, other rare disease communities. I think people in the audience like Megan O'Boyle and Ron Bartek and Sharon Hesterly will tell you I steal from everyone I can. I collect it, see what's going to apply. We share, we collaborate because it's really important, and we equally care about the rare disease community. So these are the kinds of things that are out there. I have to say I'm not very techno-savvy. I can turn on the computer and I can do some things, but we have other people that help me with that, and certainly I call them often my Barbie and Ken dolls because they seem to be very young and very able to know all of the things that I'm supposed to know. Okay, so just a little bit about Duchenne. Duchenne muscular dystrophy is the most common pediatric muscular dystrophy diagnosis. 1 in 4,600 boys will have Duchenne muscular dystrophy. 1 in 4,600 girls are likely to be carriers. I remember that well now. It's a single gene disorder, and it sounded pretty simple at first when the gene was discovered in 86 and 87, and some of the leading scientists would just say to us, you know, we just have a vector and we're just going to take that and we're going to put it together and deliver it. And I kept thinking, that sounds a little too easy. And now 20 years later, it turns out to be a challenge. The diagnosis happens between the ages of 4 and 6 years old. The loss of function is over 20 years. So the boys are born looking quite normal. They reach their milestones, although they're delayed, and then they reach a plateau at some point, and it can be early, 7, 8 years old. It can be 12 or 13, after which time they start to lose function. By the time they're late teenagers, they don't move their arms, their breathing is impaired, they need non-invasive ventilation, and they're often dead before they're 30. In my particular case, my sons were dead at 15 and 17, and that was, again, 20 years ago when that was exactly the mean age of death. At that time, we lacked a rigorous natural history study. We're thinking about drugs, we kind of looked at Duchenne and we said, well, they're all alike, right? They're all the same. It's single gene disorder. They're going to progress the same, but they didn't. And we didn't have the natural history study. So now, when we think about PPMD strategy, what we want, and the strategy was created and organized by our scientific director, called Better, Faster, Now. And those are words I really like. I like things, I want the best drugs, I want them to go fast and recruitment to happen fast, and I'd like a change in the prognosis now. So we look at preclinical, we look at and support clinical infrastructure. We advocate both on the Hill and certainly by meeting with folks in all of the government agencies, to include DOD, NIH, the CDC. We also interact with the FDA because it's really important, and because the conversation has shifted, and because we're not one of the 20 diseases. So it's not and I won't call that a slam dunk, but just for our conversation, I'll say, if you're one of the 20, it feels like from the outside that you have a leg up from somebody who isn't one of the 20. So it's up to us to be a little bit proactive. And then we also educate. We educate about drug development, clinical trials, management of expectations. How do you, when you want something right now, how do you manage the expectations? How do you manage expectations when a mom has a child who was just diagnosed and would like magic and like to be out of this world of Duchenne muscular dystrophy? How do you manage expectations? All right, so what can we do? We look at things like this. We look at the net present value. When we look at our investments, we look at what that investment's going to lead to and what value is going to come of it. And I won't go through all this, and it would be better if Sharon did, so I'll let her give you a scientific talk at some point. Our strategy is race. We're in a race. We do research, advocacy, care, and education. You can flip that around and call it care. I like race because I like things to happen right away as quickly as possible. We advocate, and that is preparation, creating relationships, and storytelling. We want to know the stories because the perspectives of all of our patients are likely to be different. The perspectives of those families are likely to be different. And so we need to learn and listen to all of them, not just a few. We want to influence funding. We want to influence focus. And we want to influence flexibility. And that's where the FDA comes in. So this is our drug development strategy, the better, faster, now concept I mentioned. We want to get the best candidates of drugs to go into clinical trial. We want to try to reduce some of the conflicting problems that might occur. So we want to select the best candidates, and we use as much information, gather as much information, do as much due diligence as we can to really select the best quality. We want it to be faster. So that means recruitment. That means investing in a natural history study. And that, for some of our patients and families, doesn't seem very sexy. Why would you want natural history? I know about my son. Well, because if we have rigorous natural history, then perhaps the FDA will think it's sufficiently rigorous. Maybe there's a chance that we can do novel design trials. Maybe there's a chance that we could get around a placebo at some point, because each day we don't treat these kids, they're losing function. So we invest in these kinds of things. We invest in developing surrogate markers, such as an MRI or such as dystrophin as a potential surrogate. We want to change the course of this by making it faster. And now, reviewing the FDA-approved drugs and relevance to see if they're useful. Every other minute, it seems, the patient gets a Google response that says, and I'll make this up, aspirin works in Duchenne. It doesn't actually, but if parents get this, and if it's an approved drug, they think, well, I'll just give it, right? Why not? Why not? What could it hurt? We already know about aspirin. We know what it does. We know what the side effects might be. I'll just give aspirin. Well, that doesn't ever get us to, does aspirin work? And P.S., it was based on a single study out of a single lab that was not verified. So what we did is sort of look at all of those drugs, and we found that none of them could be verified. So we're back to basics on that. And that's really important information as well to parents who want to do something now. So now we're looking about how can we do other things that might be able to prioritize some of these drugs to go into trial. So this just kind of gets back into the better situation of what we do. We partner, we steal, as I mentioned. We use Treated MD's TACT program to review things. In fact, when someone comes into us with a proposal, we might suggest that they go to TACT. If they haven't been, we do suggest that they go to TACT. We have an independent lab that validates some of the animal data, and we continue to provide expert advice throughout the lifetime of a project. Our projects are milestone driven, and Sharon and her group manage them quite well. So this is, again, faster, and I've talked a little bit about this. We help recruiting for trials. We'll often give block grants because there's a group of people that are engaged, and they will do anything, make any plans with their families, find the money, steal the money, do whatever they have to participate in trials. But there are other people who just can't, where gasoline might not work, and other children who aren't very accommodating, perhaps, and maybe they need a bribe. And for those of you who have children, bribe seems to be the way to go with children. And so some of these block grants will help give that movie an extra something or other so that these parents and their children can participate in trials. The faster we recruit, the faster those trials can be completed, analyzed, and hopefully, with some luck, become meaningful in terms of benefit for these families. We would love use of centralized IRBs. We have now invested in what's called the superhighway to look at how can we break down the legal infrastructure, because in a multi-site trial, feels like it takes years to get some of these sites open. So if there was a centralized IRB process and we could eliminate some of the legal infrastructure that goes site by site by site, would we get these trials up and running faster? We believe that we would. And we continue to efforts to identify looking at these young boys, as well as to include older non-ambulatory boys. All right, the now part of this I mentioned to you is where we looked at approved drugs. We want to create the prioritized list, and we want to expand the search to other drugs that might be useful in this population. So then, this is the brilliant part. Now we're in a discussion with the FDA. And to be honest, I worried that we might never get here. I've been around a long time, and I kept thinking, come on. So now we're at the FDA, which is really terrific. So the first thing that we did as an organization is our board got together and developed a policy. They really wanted to look at what do we think about our relationship with FDA? What policies do we as an organization want to have that we could deliver to FDA? What's going to be our strategy with them? So we did that. The second thing we did was develop a white paper. And the white paper was really to look at policy. What does this PDUFA 5 say? And how does Duchenne fit into it? So we really wanted to have that on paper so that we had a guide and so that we could share that with our community so that we were consistent. consistent in our thoughts, in our discussions with FDA, so we weren't all saying 1,000 different things, because I think it's really important that the FDA hears a consistent message about moving things forward and about flexibility and about understanding this high unmet need and about moving things as quickly as humanly possible. The other side of this is our learning process about the complexity of the FDA and about what they have to think about, the strategies they employ, the things and the thoughtfulness that they go through to understand whether this particular compound should go into the clinic, should be tested in human beings. What are they worried about? So we wanted this to be a shared learning experience with them. And now we have now developed and getting ready to publish our risk-benefit framework in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. When we've been to the FDA and we say things like the equation of benefit risk is different in rare disease than it is in common diseases, and it's specifically different in Duchenne. Parents are willing to accept a great deal of uncertainty. They really want to get these drugs into them. We talked to them about doing nothing is doing harm. And so they came to us and said, where's the data? So we decided we would like to provide that for them and did. So I'm going to just go through a little bit about what we did. In order to develop our white paper, I won't share the policy with you because it really just outlines the strategy that I'm talking about. In order to develop a white paper, we gathered together really experts in the field to help us with this. And you'll recognize a lot of the names. Marlene Hafner, ex-FDA. Diane Dorman is NORD. Emil Kakis is Every Life Foundation. He was with BioMarin. So Lee Sweeney is one of University of Pennsylvania. So we really gathered together experts who could help us think through, what does this policy mean? How do we interpret it? And what does it mean for Duchenne? We then created the white paper after about, seems like forever, but 3 or 4 months of work. We were able to write this paper and really put some things on paper about, we want the expanded use of accelerated approval. And this falls right in line with PDUFA 5. Issue clear guidance outlining the level of evidence required for the use of surrogate endpoints, because that's the tough one, the surrogate endpoints, because surrogate endpoints would really help us. In common diseases, you have them. In HIV, you have viral load. In cholesterol issues, you have cholesterol. We don't have those surrogate endpoints, and we know there's variability in the disease. We've been supporting the natural history studies all along. Adaptive approval. Now, I'll just say that wasn't received very well because the conditional approval is done in Europe, but not here. But we wanted to lay it out there because we think for serious and life-threatening diseases, that might be something we could talk about down the road. And then give greater risk for the risk-benefit, because parents have preferences. Doing no harm is certainly important, but also recognizing that the disease itself is doing great harm to these children. So how do we view risk-benefit? Now, Holly P.A. in our organization really took on this program of risk-benefit. She's a social scientist, and I said, just ask a few questions, we'll get the answers. And unfortunately, that really doesn't work about getting a solid survey and doing an experiment that has real value for the FDA. So luckily, we have Holly P.A., who collaborated with John Bridges from Hopkins. Together, they developed a survey instrument that was sent out. And this was paired choice methodology, and so apparently in terms of surveys, this was an experiment that was hopefully going to be successful, and at the end of the day was successful. We distributed through all the channels that we had to include the MDA and our Duchenne Connect, which is a patient self-report registry, and then analyzed this with the help of the statisticians and the Hopkins folks. So we had these screening questions, and they were really, we wanted to get them spread widely through a wide demographic. It turns out that we didn't have as wide as we wanted, and when we presented to the FDA, they suggested that we expand it, which we plan to do. So we wanted to look at these paired choices, understand what do you as parents want? Now, I will say we haven't surveyed the young adults or the adolescents, which we are planning to do as well. But this was 119 adults, and we wanted to know what's most important to you and what are your greatest worries. So we did exactly that. And this just shows you the benefit risk, higher and lower levels, side effects risk, the side effects between 1 and 10%, and the death between 1 and 10%. I can tell you that the patients and the parents who did this survey said that they had never thought about this thoroughly, this deeply, and it really made them think to go through the survey. We used words like hemorrhage as a side effect. And we knew that that's a really big word and some people might not understand it, but we knew that it probably would frighten them a bit because that word has been in their vocabulary somewhere down the line. So we had worries that were real worries, and death was certainly a worry. And what the conclusions are, that they prioritize muscle function over any other attribute. So what they wanted is their child stabilized in the disease course right there. Stop it. Stop Duchenne, end Duchenne right here. That's what they prioritized. Their least significant worries were themselves. Their most significant worries were their child, stopping progression, finding the best doctors to care for them. That's what they wanted most. We do outcomes research, and this is really in collaboration with a number of groups, because for children who are non-ambulatory, typically are not included in trials, because currently the 6-minute walk test is the primary outcome for our trials. As you can imagine, in a progressive debilitating diseases, this leads out the very young who are unable to really participate in trials because they don't get the 6-minute walk test. And I think for a 3-year-old, there's not enough bribes in the world to get them to agree to the 6-minute walk test and perform it without incident or without breakdowns. And for those who are off their feet, it feels like they're in the back of the bus and they're not going to participate. And as their disease progresses, then the wonder is, will they ever have a chance to benefit from something that might provide exactly that? So we're looking at outcomes, and this is another, we begin and end with a patient. This is a non-ambulatory patient who realized not because of any drug he could still cross his legs, and you can see the smile on his face. He didn't think he could do that. He posted it on Facebook. So outcomes research incorporating the entire population across the spectrum of an illness in the clinical research is really, really important, because the very little guys who likely stand to receive the most benefit from an intervention and the older guys who are non-ambulatory, where every single muscle fiber left is precious to them, need to be included. So we need new trial designs. So this is our interaction with the FDA, to show them this high unmet medical need, to provide them with the data that they feel is going to be valuable so that they can understand novel trial designs and agree understanding where the Patrick Dengers of the world are, and to have novel trial designs, to be flexible in the review process, knowing that doing nothing is doing harm. Thank you.
So what I'd like to do is to have Amy and Pat sit at the table and take some questions from the audience, because I think this has just been an extraordinary discussion of the FDA's effort to engage with patients to learn about what patients want, and an extraordinary presentation of an effort by a person who's run a voluntary group for longer than she probably ever wanted to, of how you can take advantage of the FDA's willingness, even if you're not one of the special 20. So, questions? Ron.
Fantastic presentations, Andrea and Pat. Thank you. Question about what both of you referred to in terms of all the emphasis in the patient-centered and patient-focused development program has been largely on the 20 diseases over a 5-year period. And Andrea, you mentioned early in your presentation that there are other methods, there are other mechanisms for hearing the patient's voice. Some of them are long-standing, some of them are the result of PDUFA 5. And could the two of you talk a little bit about those other mechanisms? I know, Pat, you're a champion of, as you indicated, meetings with the FDA. Meetings with the FDA are not restricted to the 20 diseases, obviously, as you've demonstrated. But there are a lot of other meetings that we can all go to, and in addition to the advisory committees and so forth. Could you just flesh out the things we can all be doing to coordinate better and educate better our FDA colleagues?
our meetings, as mentioned, have been really knocking at the door and saying we'd like to schedule a meeting, and then we'd like to schedule another meeting, and also after the meeting providing notes. Here's what we heard during that meeting, and I have to say they didn't comment. We just wanted them to know what we heard, right? And so then so each meeting has been building upon those next meetings. Now we are thinking about and working toward the idea of a policy forum. And with some luck, we would hold that on the White Oak campus. And we would also invite others to participate. And this is really, the thought behind this is largely a recreation of what happened in Europe. The EMA has written guidance on Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And to formally answer their guidance, we, the international community, created sort of with the research and industry, a sort of a public response to that, where we invited them to a meeting that we held and paid for, and we sort of broke down the issues in terms of the unmet need, natural history, what we've learned from animals, and extrapolation. And I think that was very well received. So I think, to be consistent on both sides of the ocean, it would be nice to do a policy forum. And I still think in rare disease, where we are sometimes grouped together in terms of neuromuscular diseases, or where I really feel like we should move toward things that are collectively important, because the high unmet medical need in the muscular dystrophies is pretty consistent across, right? Mm-hmm. And so I feel like more and more we should gather together in policy forums that we support, because hearing about the budget for NINDS, I'm assured that it is consistent throughout all of the government agencies. So I feel like this is where advocacy can make a real difference by hosting forums, if they'll give us the venue at White Oak or other places. But I feel White Oak's good because the regulatory agencies folks can come without too much burden. And so I feel like the more we work together, the outside of the 20 diseases, on things that make sense to really talk about this and educate, I think would, in my view, help, as well as the model that we've created on risk-benefit. That's a model that we want to share. I know it won't exactly fit everyone, but in developing a model and being consistent together, I feel like consistent information would be very useful to the regulatory agencies.
Amy, would you like to?
Sure. So I'll just add to Pat's comment that I think something really special about PPMD is that, I mean, it's obvious that it's really impressive the work they've done and how much they've thought through what their mission is and what they want to bring to FDA. And I think that's one of the key aspects of a patient advocacy group coming to FDA is rather than coming and saying, okay, we want to talk to you about our disease or we want to get drugs approved, they have a very specific mission and objective in mind. So I think that's really key when coming to us. Ron, you mentioned earlier other mechanisms for hearing input. And for those of you that aren't familiar, we do have a patient representative program, and that is the way that we get patient perspectives on our advisory committee meetings. And these patients actually have a voting, they are voting members of this committee, and they see the data, they see the proprietary data for the particular drug that's under review, and they provide their comments and contribute to the discussion at these AC meetings. If you're interested in becoming a patient representative, or think that you have a constituent that is, you can also search this on our FDA website this is run out of our Office of Health and Constituent Affairs. So that's something that we're always actively recruiting for.
And if I could, I'd like to add.
And then if you could pass the microphone back when you're done.
That patient representative program has been expanded by PDUFA 5 to include not just the advisory committee meetings that are all market approval oriented, but really milestone meetings. Mm-hmm. And a patient representative could serve on the reviewer's side of the table at a milestone meeting. Finally, we as advocates can be invited by sponsors to milestone meetings. And we can go to pre-IND meetings and go to after phase 2 meetings and so forth and help give the patient an advocacy perspective at those.
Ron said it very well.
So there's 2 years of meetings that have not been scheduled. Would I be horribly optimistic and naive to think that perhaps the meetings in those 2 years may not be so disease specific, but perhaps more like what Pat was describing, clusters, neuromuscular degeneration, autisms, epilepsies, where you have groups of people represented on one day, Please say I'm not overly optimistic.
I think you're moderately optimistic and fairly optimistic. So that's definitely something we've thought about. And I think the challenge here is not having too broad a range of perspectives that we can't all agree on the same thing. So if we have 5 different groups of patients in the room and they're saying, well, this is the symptom that really matters to me, and this is and symptom B is the one that matters to me, then I think it'd be hard to have a really rich discussion. And you might as well have a 5-day long meeting and really get into depth about which symptoms are important to those patients. But it is something, if you noticed, we are grouping Parkinson's and Huntington's together in the second 2 years of PDUFA. And that's because we looked at those and we said, okay, these are similar enough where we could get a really productive discussion going. But it is something that we're thinking about and trying to figure out how can we make that feasible.
And in terms of being perfect guinea pigs, because we're not in FDA discussions right now, those of us who have registries or are preparing to have registries, are there questions that would be like we should make mandatory in our registries, something that you want us to be asking our patients from the get-go that would be helpful for you down the road?
I think that's a great question. And you can see that a lot of patient groups have had success in using the general set of questions that we put out there. And I think that's something to think about. But I think another thing to look at is having communications with our Office of Rare Diseases, our Office of New Drugs, and our Rare Disease Program within CEDAR. That's Ann Pariser's group, if you're familiar with her, and she's really a huge advocate for natural history diseases. So I think she's really the one to connect with in terms of what you should make sure to ask.
Susan.
Yeah, is this on? Yes.
Yeah.
This is amazing information and great presentations. I just was wondering, and I'm sorry if I missed this, I came in a little bit late. Are there concrete examples of things how you have seen this actually transform or change the course of some action by the FDA? Are there examples you could share?
I can't share any examples because the meetings are in that broader context of outside of a specific application. And to my knowledge, I'm not sure if any actions have been taken within those disease areas, but one concrete piece of feedback we've heard is that one of the division directors came away from a meeting and said, wow, I had no idea that fatigue was such a huge impact on these patients. That's something we really need to explore more. And the other piece of the puzzle is the drug companies. And we've had a lot of attendance from that sector, and they're really the ones that are defining those endpoints. And that's another part of the untold story that the patient groups should be, hopefully the sponsors are also talking to patient groups and identifying those endpoints early on.
This is a question for Pat. Pat, the risk benefit is very interesting in light of it's in regard to children. And so can you help me understand the parents' perspective as well as the children age, do the children get any kind of say in risk benefit post-adolescent? How did you guys handle that?
Yeah, so this is a pilot, and this was 119 parents. The mean age of the parents was, I think, 40, 41, and the mean age of their child was 14, wasn't it? I think it was, yeah. So when we met with the FDA and provided the data to them, they said to us, you're going to need to ask the patients. Now, we have a hypothesis that we worry, let's say, we worried about the parents. We thought that as the child lost function, that they might be less inclined to participate in clinical trials, and their hope and expectations might change. At least in this pilot data, that wasn't the case. No matter where this child was or young man was in his progression, they wanted it stopped, and they wanted to preserve muscle function. I think what we've learned, and this is anecdotal at the moment from interviewing some of the young adults, and we've interviewed several for a film we did, and so it's probably 10 to 15 individuals that we've actively engaged in the conversation. And basically their view is that, and we've asked them specifically, what would you like preserved in terms of thinking about outcomes? All of them were interested in preserving I should say, on the other side of this, none of them felt like life was over. All of them were optimistic. All of them had hoped that function of the hand or wrist was maintained so that they could communicate, they could text. Some of them voiced that they were hoping that their respiratory apparatus would stay intact so that they wouldn't need non-invasive ventilation. So we do have to survey them in a very formal way to get the data. But I feel like we're going to learn from them as well as their families that muscle function and preserving it, which in fact preserves their quality of life, is the most important thing for them.
Okay, one last question for this session, and then we'll start with Dr. Croft.
Ms. Furlong, I'd like to say how much I appreciated hearing the story of your organization and your mission. When you talk about, I think the answer is hope. We all need hope. And our story with polymicrogyria is a lot like your story with Duchenne dystrophy, and the fact that we were just, slapped in the face. There's no hope. Your child's never going to have a quality of life. And I think that speaks to the whole issue is quality of life, and that risk benefit is no one wants to be able to give up hope. So when we talk about that risk benefit, what we're willing to do, I know I can speak for many of our parents who would be overjoyed to participate in something that was, for example, CDB trials right now. Marijuana it's a derivative of marijuana, which is highly controversial, but it's one of the promising things for refractory epilepsy, which is huge for us. So, I just want to know, are you very successful in really impacting FDA's outcomes? Their view of how they will function with, how do I want to say it? That it makes a difference, that we're willing to accept that risk. Has that really impacted FDA's view of what they'll accept?
At least we don't have a drug approved at this moment. We have a pipeline that's really full, which is quite amazing to see and always sort of catches me when I say it out loud. So I can't say to you that this has all influenced them and we have 10 drugs approved. I can't say that. But I can say to you that in public forums, when different individuals from the Division of Neurology speak, they speak about this unmet need. They now have data about this, about the risk benefit. We've presented on the folks who are doing the natural history have presented on natural history. So I think they see the clinical variability. I think that they've heard enough from patients anecdotally what makes a difference, and now they have hard data to suggest that what they are hearing anecdotally makes a difference. So in public forums, I've heard them say that. So I have to say that they understand Duchenne better than they ever maybe would have liked to understand Duchenne. They may be having nightmares about all of us kind of coming down on them. But so I do think it's going to influence how they look at these, how they review drugs in light of the disease, in light of the fact that it's every day that these children are not treated, something else is going to happen in terms of loss of function. So I do think it influences them. And I also know that we've shown them videos of, for instance, of non-ambulatory patients. And one in particular is referred to by some of them. And this is a young adult who was sitting in his wheelchair with his hands below the table and said, the most important thing for me would be to be able to get my hands of my own accord on the table. He said the only way I could do this, and he demonstrated, and the children do this, it's very consistent across, they use their fingers as levers to move their arms up, and then stick their fingers in their mouth and pull with their head, their elbow on the table, so that they can move or do whatever. So their fingers are sort of the way that they get to things. And I did see a lot of people just put their head down. They didn't fully grasp how, when we talk about muscle function and muscle weakness, it's hard to understand what that really looks like in everyday life. So having these young adults say that, show that, has been very impressive. So I think it's a combination of things. It's not only the anecdotal stories, but it's confirming that with data about what patients need and want, what worries them, what risk they're willing to take. I think that, at least I feel, and hopefully we will see some approvals in the next 12 to 18 months. I think that it will bear fruit. I believe that a relationship with FDA is a partnership. I can't imagine being faced with more than 7,000 rare diseases to know them all intimately. So I think it's your job as a rare disease community to inform them, and to inform them not only, I was reminded that it can't be just 10 crying women in a corner, because I would have been one of the 10, right? It has to be facts and it has to be data. I was also in Europe at the EMA when one of the folks said to me, "Don't give me emotions, just give me data." I said, "Well, I'm going to give you both because I think it's really important." And I also think we have to remember, because the FDA feels sort of like this place hidden behind a wall, right, that we don't have any access to, and they must think and do things behind that wall that we'll never be informed about. I think going with sponsors, you are informed about their deliberation process. You see how thoughtful they are, how the statisticians talk about, I can't claim anything about statistics, but how they really thoroughly go through this so that at the very best possible decision is made under these circumstances. And I think at the end of the day, it's also about getting it right, getting them the data they need, because the payers are going to have to reimburse for these drugs. And so we have to get this piece right so that they're reimbursed for drugs. So I do think it's a partnership. At least my experience and the experience I think of PPMD has been that they're receptive, they're open, they'll call us on something, like when I said conditional approval, and they all went, "We don't do that in this country." I was like, well, maybe we could. So we introduced it. That doesn't mean it'll ever happen, but it means that we're thinking about it. And maybe someday in the middle of the night, it'll come to somebody to think about it on this side. So I think it's a working partnership. And I think as any partnership, it takes some work.
So great. Thank you very much. These were wonderful presentations. And I think one of the most important pieces was there's a formal mechanism that you heard about through Amy, but then Pat told you how you work it if you're not one of the selected. And I thought there was an excellent roadmap for how you approach the FDA, the notion of a white paper, and other pieces like that obviously they've piloted and that others might want to take advantage of.